Welcome to Keto Life Support, where we make your keto life sustainable, fun, and low stress. I'm Kim Howerton, and I'll be coming to you weekly with some of my keto besties to bring you the practical, real-world keto advice that you need. Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and even if we do have a doctor in the house from time to time, he or she is not your doctor, and nothing we say on this show should be taken as medical advice. Always check in with a trusted medical professional about your own personal medical concerns.
Hello and welcome to Keto Life Support. This is Kim Howerton with episode number 166. And on today's episode, we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A. Well, not just a little bit, a whole bit of a Q&A. So for the first question, I'm going to jump to some things that came in from people that listen to the podcast. Anthony asked, the calories part is what confuses me. We're told counting calories isn't important, but then you hear about being in a caloric deficit and you need to do reverse dieting to take in more calories. What is it? And do we care about calories or not? So based on the questions that I got, a lot of these will involve talking about calories, so I might as well just dive in the deep end with the calorie discussion. So let's have at it. What Anthony is talking about is that there are a lot of people in the keto and low carb world who will say some variation on either don't count calories or calories don't count. And these are actually two different messages. I just want to be clear. Don't count calories means you don't have to count them, but it doesn't necessarily mean the person doesn't think that they exist or matter. Like they're not like magical fairies, right? Now, some might say calories don't count, and that I have a lot more of an issue with because often for that, people are saying that they're essentially not real, which is, I think, more problematic. I'll give you my perspective. Anyone you talk to might have a different perspective. But my perspective is calories absolutely do count, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to count them. Let's look at it this way. Let's say you are incredibly wealthy. You are incredibly wealthy and you have an unlimited bank account, or at least reasonably unlimited, right? And you have plenty of money to cover all your basic needs. And you're not super extravagant. You know, you live pretty well, but you also don't go on expensive vacations and you don't do crazy things. And you have like a reliable used car. You know, your house is paid off or very low rent. Do you need to keep a budget? No, you don't. You got plenty of money. You got surplus of money. You're not going to run out of money. You're living well within your means and you're just going through your day-to-day life. Does that mean that money is fake? No, it does not. It just means that you naturally have aligned your life to fit within your financial situation. And just like that, calories are a unit of measure. And if you are eating in a way where your hunger is naturally managed and you pick foods that are appropriate for your body and you eat in a quantity that is appropriate for your energy level, you will be able to manage your weight and health without ever having to track calories. And so a lot of people who say are carnivore or eat, you know, a mostly meat-based diet and don't eat a lot of highly processed food, don't eat junk food, and don't eat a lot of like very calorically dense foods, they might manage their weight completely effortlessly without ever having to count a calorie. However, they have fit hand into glove into the right situation for them. But if you are doing all the things you think you should do to manage your food intake properly by changing the details of your diet in terms of food choices, in terms of quantity, like, you know, not eating giant portions, maybe you think you're doing the non-calorically directly measuring ways of managing, and you still weigh considerably more than you think you should, it just seems kind of dumb to me to not start looking at calories. It's just like, wow, my bank account is constantly overdrawn. Why is that happening? Like, you might need to look at your bank statement and see what you're actually spending to understand where the money is going so that you can then say, oh, I probably shouldn't be buying that, right? And similarly, when you manage your calories, if it's not going according to what you think should be happening, by looking at the data of what's going on with your macros, you could say, oh, wow, maple syrup has a lot more calories than I thought it did, right? Or whatever. And then you can have useful data to adjust from. Am I saying that calorie counting is perfect? Absolutely not. Am I saying there's no margin for error and everything is spot on? No, I am not. But just like when you're having a budget in your life, even if you forgot to put the pack of gum you bought on your budget, right? Even if you made a little mistake, even if you forgot to add the tip onto a purchase, right? You're in the ballpark. And being in the ballpark is better than not knowing what state you live in, right? And so, do calories matter? They absolutely do. Does everyone need to track calories? Absolutely not. Who should track them? People who aren't seeing the results that they want when they're eating the way they think they should. If you are in the ballpark of what you want to weigh and you feel healthy and you function well and you've got plenty of energy, do I think that person needs to track calories? Absolutely not. That's ridiculous. Don't do more work than you need to. But the person who's frustrated, tearing their hair out, feels broken, crazy, and can't figure out why they can't get under 200 pounds, yeah, you probably do. All right, next question. From Manning, people say that if you're eating only fatty meat, that when you're full, you will stop. I never seem to get full. Am I broken? What's going on? Why is my signal out of whack? So back to the first question, a lot of people can naturally regulate their hunger when they eat nutrient-dense and filling foods. Not everyone can. First, I'd like to say you're not broken. No one is broken, but some of us are unique and have unique challenges. And hormones are part of the hunger signaling experience. So if you're never getting full, like you never get full, there's probably something a little out of whack with your hunger signals. In which case, I would say you probably want to track and figure out if meals based around certain macros that might work well for you, at least theoretically, might help you get a handle on what the amount of food that you should be eating might look like. So don't stress so hard. Not everyone has a stop button. And maybe you will be able to learn and develop one. Maybe over time, when you start tracking and saying, okay, that is an appropriate meal size, I should stop there. You might start to learn to recognize some of the very subtle hunger signals and fullness signals that you are blowing past before. And some of us will be able to develop these skills over time. So Manning, I would say for now, you probably, if you never get that signal that you've had enough. Oh, actually, first I'll say some people don't go far enough to get to that signal. So if you've never actually tried, keep eating, eat a lot. Like this is not for the rest of your life, for an experiment for a day, don't get anxious because I see this happen sometimes. Don't be like, well, I think that's enough, so I'm going to stop here. Keep going until you've eaten a pound of meat in a sitting and say, do I actually feel different? Do I feel full? And if you don't, okay, I get it. Then you're probably indeed are right that some of your hunger signals are a little bit off. But there are some people that need quite a bit of food to fill them up, but then they eat less often. So maybe you might eat a pound of meat at a sitting or even a pound and a half. But then you're like, wow, I'm not hungry again today, right? You're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. That's how my body works. Or you might only eat 2 meals and the second one is much smaller because you were still kind of full from the first meal. And so the first thing I would say is give yourself a couple of days to a week to really push into that edge and see if you can hit a place where you feel satisfied. And if that truly doesn't happen, then I would say, all right, let's accept that this might get out of control And we don't want to see you gain a ton of weight doing this. So let's start tracking and let's try and determine what an appropriate amount of food in a sitting is for you. And you might need assistance with that, a coach, a nutritionist, somebody who can help you make good decisions, or even just a friend who's had a lot of experience here. And then you run your own experiment to see if you can start to cue in to the subtler cues that you might be missing. And just continuing on the theme, I'll do non-calorie questions on another episode. Niece said, how important are calories when trying to lose weight on keto if you keep it to 20 total grams of carbs? So back to the first question, a lot of people, when they go keto, they bring those carbs down. Their hunger signals get stronger. They get a lot more able to manage their hunger, and they naturally have some hunger suppression from being in ketosis. This is especially true at the beginning. A lot of people say this does not persist for multiple years, and some people say it does. Your results may vary. But certainly, if you start a keto diet, you may notice that you're more satiated on less food than you were before. And you're eating more nutrient-dense, highly filling foods, whole foods. And if you do that, you might find your hunger naturally regulates. So how do you know if you have to count calories versus not count calories? As I said in the first question, how's your weight doing? How's your health doing? How do you feel? If everything's going swimmingly, don't add more complication. Maybe counting carbs is enough for you. But if you're not seeing the results you want, and obviously be patient, don't expect Rome was not built in a day and you did not gain 200 pounds overnight. You're not going to lose it overnight. So employ some patience, don't have unrealistic expectations, but certainly you can then evaluate if what you're doing is enough. Don't apply more pressure than you need to. By the way, my voice is very deep this morning because it is morning and I haven't spoken to anyone yet. So enjoy. I like it. I hope you do too. It's not always like this. All right, let's go to my next question. Melissa says, how do you lose weight while being low carb? I want to incorporate root veg, steel cut oats, and honey/fruit/pure maple syrup to sweeten sauces and dishes. Is it possible to lose weight eating such as this? Will calorie deficit be sufficient? Do you think you could incorporate such and still lose weight after all you've learned? Or are carbs just, quote, bad all around? So to this question, I know this person has spent a lot of time being keto and is now wanting to increase their carbs to include root veggies, steel cut oats, honey, fruit, and pure maple syrup. So let me take this question in two parts. Second part of this question, will calorie deficit be sufficient? So a calorie deficit proves itself. I'll say it this way. If you're losing weight, you are in a calorie deficit. What does a deficit mean? It means a net loss. So a financial deficit means you're out of money. You're in the negative. You're in debt, right? A financial surplus means you have lots of extra money. You have savings. Same thing with calories, right? If you're in a calorie surplus, you're eating more than you need to maintain your weight. So you can think of like weight maintenance as the zero line. When you eat in a surplus, you're eating above the zero line. You're eating a positive category. So you have weight gain because you're eating above your needs. When you're in a calorie deficit, you have a negative. You're losing weight. You're in a calorie deficit. That means you've eaten less than you need to maintain your weight. One of the things I hear that seems to cause a lot of confusion is people will say things like, I don't understand. I'm eating in a calorie deficit and I'm not losing weight. That is impossible. If you are eating in a calorie deficit, it means you are losing weight. What people mean is I'm eating in what I think should be a calorie deficit based on some theoretical information I have, and I'm not seeing weight loss. What that should tell you is actually you're not in a calorie deficit, because anyone in a calorie deficit sees weight loss. If you're in a big deficit, you see a lot. In a low deficit, you see a little, but it proves itself. So the pain in the butt part of this is we all have different metabolic rates. We all have different caloric needs. And two people who look pretty similar and have pretty similar activity levels might just have very different caloric needs. And so when we get a theoretical number about what our caloric needs should be, and then we find out that that's not causing weight loss, we get pissed, right? We get upset. But the reality is we're not all the same. It's unfortunate. Life isn't fair. I belong to the low metabolism club, the slow metabolism club. And so I get your pain, but, put on your big girl panties. We're moving on. So I can't say what somebody's appropriate caloric deficit is without a lot more information, but I can say one exists for everybody. Now, again, I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying that calories are all that matter. They are not. They aren't. But they are the dial that we might use to say, what do I need to turn to see more or less weight loss? The first and most important thing is you're making appropriate food choices for being a healthy individual. I do think that can include being on a low carb diet instead of a keto diet. Heck, I think that can even include being on a moderate carb diet. The way that I tend to look at it is, though there are exceptions to this rule, the most important thing in terms of a higher versus a lower carb diet is, in general, the less active you are, the less carbs you probably need. Does that mean a very active individual has to be on a high carb diet? No, but certainly a low activity individual should probably not be on a high carb diet. So the way that I look at it is, if you're moderately active to slightly active, myself, I'm most comfortable if I'm in that state on what I would call somewhere in the low carb range. Where do I place my limits on the low carb range? Around 100 grams of carbs a day as a top level. Might that go to 120 on a special occasion or something? Maybe. But I really I like boundaries and limits. And so if this person is telling me that they want to be low carb, I would say, all right, aim to keep your carbs somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 a day. If they were an athlete, this would be a different discussion, but I do not believe they are. I mean, we're all should be some degree of athletic, but what I mean is like normal, just being a healthy human, amounts of movement and working out. I think a low carb diet is perfectly fine. So to answer the second part of the question, will a calorie deficit be sufficient to lose weight? Yes, because if you're losing weight, you are in a calorie deficit. If you're not losing weight, you're not in a calorie deficit. It proves itself. Do I think this person could incorporate root veggies, steel-cut oats, and honey and fruit and pure maple syrup to lose weight? I'll get to that in a second. The last part of this, are all carbs bad? No, there are no such thing as bad foods. There are just foods that support you or don't support you and your goals. And so I don't think of foods as good or bad. Any food could be included. Even the highest carb food could be included. It just depends how much you use of it, right? So I think, though, we have to think just like with a financial budget, we have a food budget, we have certain needs that have to get met. I think it's just a non-negotiable that we have to meet our micro and macronutrient needs in terms of being a healthy human. We have to get all the vitamins and minerals we need, and we have to get enough protein in each meal to properly fuel our body, our brain, avoid depression, avoid malnourishment, avoid sarcopenia, avoid all sorts of problems. So I have some non-negotiables before we can even get into the carbs part of the discussion. Then I have some non-negotiable understandings, I should say, some just facts, that's what those are called, about how different foods affect our body. The more processed a food is, the less full we get from it, the more hunger we're going to have. They've found that when they feed people a highly processed diet versus a minimally processed diet, the highly processed group eats on average 300 more calories a day without noticing they did so. So remember, thinking back to the beginning of this Q&A, if you're eating a highly processed diet, especially if you're not tracking, you're going to have a much harder time of managing it. The other thing is highly processed foods, though not evil, remember, no food is bad, they displace foods that are very important to getting the nutrients we need. So on this list, root veggies, I totally support the use of root veggies in a diet. If you don't want to be keto, if ketosis doesn't matter to you, again, ketosis only matters if you have certain issues going on that ketosis will help with. One of those can be hunger management, but yeah, I find great hunger management on a low carb diet. So we're all individual. You got to do your own experiments here. Root veggies, great. But we have to remember that root veggies are more calorically dense than like leafy greens. And so like a sweet potato is much more calorically dense than broccoli or cauliflower. And so if I were to be creating a food plan for myself or thinking about what foods I wanted to be eating, I might, instead of eating just sweet potatoes as my root veg, we get about 2/3 of a cup of roasted sweet potatoes for 140 calories and 32 grams of carbs. Whereas we get in a full cup of roasted broccoli, and these are roasted with a little bit of oil involved, it's 10 grams of carbs. So it's a quarter the carbs because it's more in quantity and it's less calories. So what I would say is if you want to incorporate some root veg, totally go right ahead if you want to be low carb rather than fully keto. But be aware of the calories when you're doing those and maybe do a mix, because one of the benefits of certain types of adding more carbs to your diet is you can actually eat more volume. I'd rather have a big salad or a big plate of a bunch of different root veg that includes some broccoli and some cauliflower and maybe a little bit of potato or rutabaga or whatever, rather than a teeny sweet potato, right? So think about that as you're making these changes. Let's talk about honey and pure maple syrup. That's just sugar. It's just concentrated sugar. Yes. Do they have some nutrient benefits beyond sugar, like white sugar? Sure. There are a few micronutrients in there, but just be aware it's hyper concentrated sugar. So using a little bit to sweeten a sauce, sure, a little bit to sweeten a sauce, but be aware of your tendencies. If you're somebody with a big sweet tooth, because the list I see here, it's not like I want big salads, right? It's like I want some really sweet things. All these things are very high carb. And I get that you're asking about carbs, so there's no shame in the game. I'm just noticing that if you have a tendency towards loving things super sweet, be cautious and make sure you're weighing and measuring and being careful that way. Because if you have a very high sweet tooth, I'm just going to say, like, if you have a weight issue and you love carbs and you love sweet things, there's a reason you got into trouble in the first place. And there's a reason that low carb helped or keto helped, because keto kind of eliminates a lot of the high carb choices that were maybe in a way your drug of choice. So if you want to see if you can reincorporate some of these foods, I'm totally fine with it, but you got to walk cautiously here. So I got curious about the steel cut oats because it's been a year. No, when I say a year, I mean, it's been like a decade since I've had steel cut oats. So I thought, well, let me do an experiment. And I actually asked for this person's recipe for the oats that they make. And here's what it was. 1 cup of steel cut oats, 1/3 of a cup chopped dried apricots, 1/4 cup honey or maple syrup, water, cinnamon, a tablespoon of coconut oil, 1 scoop of vanilla protein powder, some vanilla extract, a cup of blueberries, and a 1/2 cup of chopped walnuts. So when I put that recipe into my tracker, that made 4 servings, by the way. Per serving, it was 431 calories, 16 grams of fat, 60 grams of carbs, and 14 grams of protein. So what do I see here is the issue? First of all, the calories for a meal seem fine. They're within range. What calories any person can eat are going to vary, a bigger person versus a smaller person, all that kind of stuff. But something in the 400 range doesn't make me freak out, for sure. The carbs are around 60, which is high for a low carb diet. Remember, I said I'd like to see somebody stay under 100 grams on most low carb days. And I don't like to see people going over about 40 grams in a meal, give or take, because it's just too hard for a body, I think, that is not using those carbs well with a lot of activity. And so this is excessive to me. But what is excessive? So let's go back and look. Well, first of all, and then, the last thing, which is a very important detail, 14 grams of protein is inappropriate for a meal. So what can we do to change this up? So I'm going to stop here and say, I have a tendency to problem solve. I am currently problem solving eating oatmeal. A question that should be asked before we problem solve eating oatmeal is, should I just not eat oatmeal? Right? If you are like, oatmeal is my favorite food in the world and I love it, then I would say we can find a way to work it in. If you are just eating oatmeal because you think oatmeal has like a health halo and is a healthy food, and then you add a ton of sugar and maple syrup and dried fruits to it so that it's palatable to you, then I would just say maybe it's not the oats that you really like. And this is not shaming anyone, but this is a really sweet breakfast. I'm looking at it. I'm going to actually have my boyfriend and I make it later and this recipe and confirm. So hold on to that and I'll come back and report on it after he gets out of the shower and we have breakfast. But in terms of the macronutrients here, what am I going to say? I'm going to say there's 4 tablespoons of maple syrup in this. That's a tablespoon a serving. That's a lot of maple syrup. There's some dried apricots. Dried fruit is incredibly sugar intensive, and so that might be a problem. There are fresh blueberries in here. I might eliminate or reduce the dried apricots. There's, as I said, a ton of maple syrup or honey, either one. That's a lot. It's a lot of sugar. And there's only 1 scoop of protein powder. Protein powder is sweetened. This is vanilla protein powder. So protein powder is sweetened. So you'd get a lot of sweetness from protein powder, and you need more protein in this dish. So I might triple the protein powder or so, which would bring the protein up to closer to 25, 26 grams. And I would cut back on the maple syrup and maybe the dried apricots until I got maybe more around 40 total carbs. And so I'll let you know how the experiment goes with making this recipe and seeing if I'm correct that it's very, very sweet. And so trying to adjust from there. In terms of adding some fruit to the diet, which was another part of this question, I would say I think fruit is great for a lot of people. I do think, maybe going with a lower fructose fruits. And I think it goes without being said, hopefully, if you have fatty liver or you have any hint of diabetes, don't use maple syrup, honey, or a lot of fruit or oats. Okay. All right. This question was purely about if weight loss is possible. And I just want to put it out there that I'm talking about weight loss in a otherwise healthy individual, not somebody with severe metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, that kind of thing. So can a person with insulin resistance still lose weight on a low carb diet? Absolutely. But you have to then probably monitor your blood sugar to make sure it's staying within relative control in terms of what your food choices are. So I think that answers the question. Can you lose weight by being low carb? Yep. You can lose weight by being in a calorie deficit. Will that calorie deficit change based on how you're eating? Yep. But if you're eating a certain way and you're eating 2,000 calories and you're eating the same way and you're eating 1,300 calories, that you're more likely to lose more weight at 13, right? Because it's less. Anyway, is it possible to incorporate things like root veggies, steel-cut oats, honey, pure maple syrup, and fruit in your diet and still lose weight? Yes, as long as you're doing them in appropriate quantities for you and your health and your needs. Do I think you can incorporate these? I don't know. You can try and you can see what happens. Where might you get into trouble and where might you, I'm speaking to any you who's listening, need to be able to pay attention? Can you eat a half cup of sweet potato and be like, that was awesome, I am satisfied now? Not alone, I mean, eat it with other foods and stuff. Or are you just going to keep eating? Like, I have sweet potatoes in my house. I'm just going to keep eating them until I've eaten all the sweet potatoes because they're sweet and they're good and they're delicious and I want them all. And I'm binging on sweet potatoes. And no. Then probably that's not a good food for you because it's a trigger food for you. So I don't know what your trigger foods are, but if you can self-manage with these foods included in your diet, more power to you. Go right ahead. It's not a problem if it's not a problem. And it's a problem if it's a problem. In theory, it's not a problem. But there's always trigger foods for all of us. And that line is in different places for different people. And just my overall warning here is sugar adds up quick, just like fat does. Oh, that brings me to another point. If you're eating a low carb diet versus a keto diet, as your carbs come up, your fat comes down. So when we're deciding what to eat, protein is just a given. We need to eat sufficient protein for our bodies. That's somewhere between 0.7 and 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight or reference body weight or goal body weight. That takes up part of your caloric budget. And then The rest you have to spend on the fun stuff, the energy, fats, and carbs. If more of the budget is going towards carbs, less of that budget has to go to fat, right? Because you have, just like a financial budget, there's only so much money you earn. You have a food budget. You have a caloric budget, depending on your goals, right? If you earn a certain amount of money, but you're saving for a big trip, you can't spend all your money. You got to put some of it away. If your metabolism says you can eat a certain amount, but you're trying to lose weight, you can't eat all that. You got to put some of it away so that you can use your own body fat to make up for it, right? It's just a budget. And so carbs are not bad. Nothing is evil, but you have to eat in a way that you feel really satisfied. So if you have a big bowl of oatmeal in the morning and you're like, I am full for like 7 to 8 hours, that was amazingly satiating. And that bowl of oatmeal or that meal, maybe you add some egg whites or you add some protein sources, but that meal has enough protein in it. And even if it has a fair amount of carbs, but you feel full and satisfied for several hours until your next meal, and you're eating an appropriate amount of calories for the whole day and everything is going swimmingly, I think that's a winning strategy. But you got to make sure that you aren't hungry 2 hours later, because that's going to make you miserable. And now you're spending all your caloric budget on carbs that aren't making you feel full. And so you have to say, I got to focus on the carbs that make me feel full if I'm adding carbs to my diet. All right, guys, I hope that helped. And that's the end of our questions for today. Take care, everybody. Talk to you next week.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Keto Life Support. Want more information? Want show notes? Want to suggest a topic? Just head over to ketolifesupport.com. That's where all that kind of thing can go on. By the way, I have a request. If you could go to your podcast host and hit subscribe, we would really, really appreciate it. And what would be even more awesome is if you could write a review. And what would be even more awesome than that is if you could write like a really flattering review. Just asking, you do you. All right. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm thrilled that you're part of the Keto fam. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.